Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexandra Gillies, and I'm talking to you from the offices of the Natural Resource Governance Institute in New York. We'll just hold on for a few more minutes and let some others join before we get started. Thanks. Great, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks a lot for joining. Hope you all can hear me okay. There is one question I see already, that whether the chat window is where you submit questions, and I'm guessing it is because I can see it. I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I think that you've all been able to view the videos for this week from the course, which discuss issues around governance and political economy and corruption. There's a lot of material there, so hopefully it's provoked some questions. I'm not going to try to review all of that content since you've hopefully had a chance to take a look at it. And instead, I'm really interested to hear from you about what your questions might be. So in that spirit, I'm going to dive in, and there's a question here about the Africa mining vision, which I think is interesting. And the question says, some in Africa believe that the Africa mining vision is the surest solution to Africa's mining woes. And what do I think about that? I think it's a bit of an optimistic belief, maybe. Not anything to do with the Africa mining vision or its strengths or weaknesses. But these international initiatives are only as good as what's made of them, right? Like on their own, they're not going to fix anything. If they're taken up with like lots of political will and are implemented year after year in a way that's very credible and has enough capacity, then yeah, they can be helpful. But what you often see is initiatives like this. They'll come in, they'll hold an event. There might be some research done, that kind of thing, but it may not have the impact on policy and the implementation of policy that we would like to see. And this is just something common to international initiatives. Doesn't mean that they're not useful. They are. They can provoke ideas. They can provoke change. But at the end of the day, it really depends on whether the leadership in the country wants to take the reforms forward. And I think that's as true for the Africa mining vision as it is for lots of other initiatives that are prompted internationally, either by the UN or the EITI or others. I think the Africa mining vision in particular really relies on country ownership. That's kind of how it's designed, that the vision is like a framework that's supposed to set out some good practices. But whether it works or not really depends on whether the country kind of picks it up. Those are my thoughts on that one. I mean, this question, I think, is a fascinating one, and it's about, how do you see the sustained crash in oil prices affecting the topic of this module? In the field of natural resource governance, this is the biggest story right now. And it's a totally different world out there than it was, 2 or 3 years ago when you had oil at over $100 a barrel, money flowing into resource-rich countries, and a bunch of other countries like in East Africa and elsewhere, really excited that they were about to become, the next kind of round of resource-rich countries. this is a very different world that we live in now. In terms of how it affects political and governance issues, I think there's a few different scenarios that could play out. Some interesting news from the DRC yesterday that the government of the DRC was in the process of trying to revise its mining code to improve the laws and regulations of how the mining sector was governed, but also to reform some of the fiscal terms, how much the companies would have to pay the government. And they decided, because investors were really under so much pressure because of the lower prices, to abandon this legal reform, that it was just not the right time. The leverage that the government had vis-a-vis the investors was really weak right now. And therefore, they chose to abandon this reform, basically as a concession to the companies, is my interpretation of it. So I think that's, and with this abandonment, some of the governance improvements, some of the transparency improvements that were embedded within that mining code are not going to move forward now. So there's one example of how governments may abandon governance reforms, and because they're under more pressure from investors, and that in terms of the balance of power between governments and companies, a resource-rich country, when prices are high, has a lot of bargaining power that they don't have right now, and that's affecting things like we just saw in the DRC. There have been a lot of questions around whether the drop in prices is good or bad for corruption. I think that, I work a lot in Nigeria, and that's an example where I think the drop in prices has been helpful. There's also a new government who's committed to anti-corruption, but they're under so much fiscal pressure right now that they're plugging some of the leakages in the oil sector. They're plugging some of the places where the corruption really took place. And that, I think, is a positive dynamic. There's just not as much money to steal, and therefore the kind of frenzy around oil sector corruption seems to have died down. I think there are other interesting questions around whether the drop in prices will fan some flames of instability, that some resource-rich countries, the oil money or the mineral money is used to appease different groups, and if that money starts to dry up, that way of governing, that way of kind of maintaining the peace might become more difficult. So that's another idea that's out there. So, I mean, this is something we've been following really closely, but there is no kind of one answer in terms of how the drop in prices is going to play out in terms of corruption or political outcomes. Just looking at the next question. I mean, so this question here from Lamech is one that we get a lot, and it's based, and I completely understand where it's coming from. Is you have all these international initiatives around transparency in particular, and yet we also see lots of corruption still taking place, lots of bad governance outcomes. The resource curse appears to be alive and well in many countries. And so are these initiatives failing? I think there's a little bit of, I think the expectations of these initiatives are too high sometimes. And I'll use the EITI as an example. The EITI is a transparency initiative. At best, what it can accomplish is making more information available and creating a platform for more dialogue across stakeholders between governments and companies and civil society. That's kind of the most that the EITI can realistically contribute. And that's good, that's useful. I mean, in terms of an international effort, if they can kind of accomplish that, that's totally worthwhile. It can't be expected to overcome decades of patterns of corruption or patterns of the abuse of power. It cannot be expected to, stand toe-to-toe with a head of state or a government that is not committed to managing the sector in a responsible manner. You're never going to have an international transparency initiative able to take on those battles. So sometimes, and again, I'll use an example from Nigeria, under the previous government, there was a 5-year period in which oil sector corruption kind of went off the charts. Even by Nigerian standards, these were historic levels of oil sector corruption. At the same time, you had the EITI running in Nigeria, and it was a lot of people said, well, is the EITI a failure? Look, there's you've got EITI existing, and you've got all this corruption. Why isn't it doing its job? And my response to that is, look, again, you have to manage your expectations. What the EITI in Nigeria was able to do during this period was to kind of quietly bear witness to how bad things had gotten. And if you read the EITI reports from Nigeria, they actually document all the ways that the sector was being managed poorly. Could they go and kind of bang down the doors of the national oil company and stop those problems? No, they couldn't. But even just talking about them in a kind of neutral, credible manner, I think was a pretty good contribution and makes the EITI, worth its time, at least in that country context. So thanks for that question, Lamek. So let's look at this question. So interesting. So what can governments do to prepare for the next mining and oil boom? We would all be very rich if we could predict when that boom was going to happen. But assuming that prices will go back up again, which I think is a fair enough assumption, the question is when. What should governments be doing? And I think that's a really interesting an important question, especially for those of us who do the kind of work that we do. How do you take advantage of kind of this pause in between resource booms, assuming that's where we are? I think the best case scenario is to set up a good infrastructure of laws and policies and practices while the pressure on spending is a little bit lower. As soon as the money starts flowing in, the bad habits come out very quickly. The kind of the temptation to spend money on things that are unnecessary, on the political demands on all of that money. There's lots of examples from this past oil boom of governments kind of acting in a very fast and loose way when it comes to spending the money. So now is the time when things have kind of cooled off to set up sovereign wealth funds, start using fiscal rules, pass sector legislation that puts kind of clear requirements on what investors how they should behave in the country. If those kinds of, and transparency as well, if those kinds of practices can be established now, when it's less high stakes, when it's less kind of this like heated spending scramble, then when prices start to go up again, those kind of habits are already ingrained. I think that's kind of the best scenario that we could see. There's an interesting situation, I think, happening in some of the emerging producers, countries that were kind of preparing for a resource boom, but then when the prices dropped, a lot of those prospects have dropped with them. A lot of those countries were trying, like Tanzania and Kenya and elsewhere, were trying to set up systems for managing this new resource wealth. And there seems to, those processes seems to have really slowed down because they're just not as interesting anymore. And I think that's too bad. I think there needs to be some continued momentum so that when prices do go up, the systems are ready and already in place. So here's one, from Prima. What do you think about the people of a resource-rich country like Indonesia to win the battles we will never win? I like that. Since almost all of the resources we have are controlled by foreign companies. I mean, that's an interesting an interesting point. If I understand you right, it's saying, how can domestic companies benefit more from natural resource wealth? And there's a number of ways in which that transition can start to happen. The first point I would make is in terms of whether people benefit from natural resources, depends on a lot of different factors. One of them is whether the resources are being extracted in a technically capable manner. So if you hire a company to get oil out of the ground or get copper out of the ground, you want a company that's fully capable technically of doing that job. Because if they're not, then there are going to be delays and they're going to be using inferior technology, and the risks of environmental problems or operational and safety problems are going to be higher. So the first point I'd make is that you want to have companies that are highly capable of doing the job they're being asked to do. Once the country's decided, okay, we're going to take these resources out of the ground, once that decision's made, then you want someone who's really good at it to be doing the job. In some cases, that can be domestic companies. In other cases, if there aren't domestic companies capable of doing that, the best choice might be international companies. And it's just up to the government to make sure that they're collecting revenues from that company in a way that's fair. So if there's an American company working in Indonesia, running some mining projects, it's up to the government to tax that company at a level that's appropriate to make sure the country benefits from that economic activity and that all the profits aren't going back to this American company. So with that said, in terms of then developing domestic capacity, that's what kind of governments have sought to handle through local content policies, local content laws. There's a lot of systems in many countries that privilege local companies so that they can start to develop capacity, and that some of these mining and oil sector opportunities go to them instead of the foreign companies. Often what you'll see is licenses, for instance, awarded to a foreign company, but then maybe 5% or 10% was reserved for a local company. And in some cases, the local company doesn't do anything, and it's just a way for, some political friend to make some money. But in other cases, and this is how it's supposed to work, the local company, through that partnership, is able to gain experience in how the sector works, and that's kind of an example of how governments can help to build domestic capacity in the sector, so that it's not just foreign companies doing all the work. So thanks for that one. Here's one from Arturo. There's a big risk of corruption in concentrated investments in infrastructure. What do I think about that? Yeah, that's certainly been borne out. And I think that something I've looked a lot at is corruption within procurement within the oil sector. And this seems to be relatively common as well. Some of you might be aware of the big corruption scandal in Brazil with Petrobras. And what you saw there was that Petrobras's own, so the Petrobras is the national oil company of Brazil. Like many oil companies, they don't do all of the work themselves. They have to subcontract a lot of the work out to other companies. So most big oil companies like Petrobras, but also private companies like Shell or Exxon or whomever, do a lot of procurement. They issue a lot of tenders to do very large projects. And what you saw in the Petrobras case was extensive collusion and corruption in those procurement processes. So for instance, if Petrobras needed to build a new kind of production facility, they would have a tender, and you had a number of construction companies that were colluding together, deciding, okay, you're going to bid this much, I'm going to bid this much, you'll get to win this one, I'll win the next one. And they were also inflating the amount of the contracts with kickbacks going to political leaders in Brazil, as well as officials within Petrobras. And billions of dollars were lost through this scheme, which has now come to light, and the Brazilian government is dealing with the consequences. This is not a unique example to Brazil, and I think it's a good example of how the different kinds of corruption risks that exist within the oil sector. There's a number of other cases. The Italian oil company Eni often bids for these kinds of oil service contracts, and in Algeria and Iraq and in a couple other countries, they've been involved in bribery scandals in order to try to win these infrastructure contracts. So there's an example of how infrastructure-related corruption occurs within the oil sector. The other kind of corruption, and maybe this is what Arturo is referring to, is in government procurement. So obviously, resource-rich countries, the government spend a lot of money, often on big infrastructure projects, and certainly there's corruption in that spending. So I think that is a serious risk. One thing that a lot of us are trying to do about that is contract transparency and procurement transparency. So making it clear, what were the terms of the bid? Why was the winner selected? What's the contract that then was signed with the winner? And another important piece is who's the beneficial owner of the company that was selected to be the winner? Who's really going to profit from the fact that this company received that infrastructure contract? So here's a question about the suit by the American Petroleum Institute against the U.S. government around the new transparency requirements. So this is I'm glad that you asked about this. This is from We Did, because there's been some movement on this. So what this is about, just as a reminder, is I think in 2012, maybe even before that, sorry, I'm forgetting the year, the U.S. government passed the Wall Street Reform Act, which is sometimes called the Dodd-Frank Act. And Section 1504 of that rule said every oil and mining company that's listed on the U.S. stock exchanges has to disclose any payments they make to governments. And this is great. So basically, if Shell's paying to the government of Nigeria, the public can know how much are they paying each year. And that enables us to ask questions around whether that amount is the fair amount. And then what does the Nigerian government then do with all this money it's collecting? So this was a huge win. The agency in the US government that's in charge of implementing this is called the Securities and Exchange Commission. So the Securities and Exchange Commission then issued some guidance on, okay, companies, this is how you should go about implementing this rule. Based on that guidance, the oil companies sued the SEC and said, no, that's too onerous. You're overstepping your mandate, and we reject that we have to do this. And as you note, the court essentially, in the decision that the court passed down, in response to the lawsuit, said, yes, the SEC has to has to implement the law because the law is still in place, but needs to do it in a more modest manner. So fast forward 2 or 3 years later, and in December, finally, the SEC released their a new version of the guidance, of the rules. And it looks pretty good. I think overall, from a civil society perspective, we're relatively happy with how they chose to move this forward. So for example, it says that the payment data needs to be broken down by project, which is very important. So it's not just one big aggregate number per country, but it's broken down by individual mine or individual oil field. So that's great. They also had pretty good language around exemptions. So the companies were saying, oh, well, we want to have a lot of exemptions if the countries where we work don't like this kind of disclosure. And the language that the SEC put forward is pretty good on that. So what's happening right now is a public comment period. So my organization and others from civil society are, putting together our comments, which I think are due in a week or two, saying the ways that, okay, these are the ways that we think the language you've put out could be improved. And the companies will be doing the same thing. And I can guarantee that they will say, you've gone too far. These are the ways it should be kind of drawn back. And then the SEC will have to take in all of those comments, make some revisions, and then those will be the final rules. Now, the oil companies could decide to sue again, but there's one reason why they may not. And that's that in the interim, during this 5 or 6 year saga, the European Union passed very similar legislation that's starting to be implemented now. So a lot of companies, a lot of the ones who were behind the original lawsuit are already having to do this kind of reporting anyway, because they're also listed or based in Europe. So there may be less resistance because it's clear that, look, this kind of reporting is going to happen one way or the other. So that's kind of an update on where that is, and thanks for the question. Okay, what's next? With apologies to Amit, I'm going to skip the question on India because it's not a country that I know very much about at all, and I wouldn't want to disappoint you. So here's one about the EITI. Could you comment on the role of civil society organizations in implementing the EITI, but also in resource governance in general? There are cases where CSOs and their networks are expressing agency. This is from Jason. Thanks a lot. There's a lot of different potential answers to that question, and it kind of depends on what kinds of civil society are we talking about. One role that civil society plays around natural resource governance is the kind of watchdog role. And you see NGOs in a number of countries exposing bad practices, whether it's corruption cases, or, for instance, if there's a law in place that isn't being implemented. I mean, that's civil society's job in a lot of ways, is to then make noise. Either it's making noise internationally to put pressure on, or making noise domestically, or talking to the media. And you do see this happen a lot around natural resource governance issues, is civil society will raise the alarm. And sometimes they face, very serious consequences for doing so. In Angola, for instance, there's a civil society activist who has commented, extensively on oil sector corruption issues, but also, environmental and safety problems around certain gold mining operations. And he was arrested and put in jail. He's since been released. So they do have, in many countries, civil society has that role to play, and they do have some agency by being able to kind of make noise and make the government look bad. But depending on the political situation, that agency can be really reined in if they face repression or intimidation. This is true in countries like Azerbaijan as well, where the governments really crack down on independent civil society and the independent media, which means that civil society can't play that role anymore. Another role that civil society can play is kind of throwing ideas in the mix about where the country should go next. And the example I just gave about the US is kind of like that civil society in the US, as this new transparency law is being implemented, are throwing in ideas, be like, look, this is how it should be implemented in order to have the maximum positive benefit. And that's like another role that civil society can play, is kind of encouraging governments to be progressive, encouraging governments to reform, taking ideas from other countries and saying, look, this is what you need to do in order to improve. What's nice about the EITI is it provides a formal space for that to happen. So the EITI in each country is run by a multi-stakeholder group, which has to have civil society participation, which means you kind of have a ready-made space where civil society can voice these kinds of concerns to government. So an example from Myanmar is, Myanmar is a country where until a few years ago, there was no such thing as dialogue between the government and civil society. And the EITI has helped kind of create those patterns of involvement. Last year, some community activists one of them were protesting in a mining community, and one was shot and killed by a policeman. And obviously, civil society was outraged about this. And they wrote kind of a protest letter explaining their grievances and what they wanted to see done, the kinds of compensation and changes in practices. And they were able to submit that letter through the EITI body. It kind of gave them an entry point to actually communicate with those in power, which I think is an interesting role, a useful role that EITI can play. Here's one that I think is an interesting one from Amandine. What's the role of private mining companies in helping or ensuring transparency at the national level? And I think there's a lot of untapped potential here. You see a few companies, both oil and mining, who choose to be more transparent than they have to be. I would say on average, companies tend to only be as transparent as they are required to be. So if either the country where they're operating or the country where they're based requires them to submit information, often they will do so, but they're not going to go above and beyond. So that's the normal. But there are some companies who've chosen to say, look, actually, we think these disclosures could be helpful, and we don't want to just do the bare minimum. So here's some of the information. Rio Tinto, huge mining company, disclosed some payment data in a level of detail that exceeded what they were required to do, for instance. Is it everything they could have disclosed? No, but I think it's helpful. We just saw something similar from a big commodity trading company called Trafigura, which is based in Switzerland. They were under a lot of pressure to be more transparent, and they said, okay, here's some information about the payments that we make to governments. A few oil companies like Cosmos and Tullow, Statoil, have, again, kind of gone above and beyond, including disclosing some contracts. And I think contract disclosure is interesting that, so Rio Tinto, again in Mongolia, chose to disclose its contract for one of its biggest projects there because there was so much public debate and controversy around this agreement that I think they saw it that it was in their best interest as a business to be transparent. So for those of us who are pushing for transparency, I think we need to target governments so they kind of put in place those requirements, but we also need to target companies and make the case, like, this is why this is in your interest. You shouldn't be threatened by this. Right now, communities and the countries where you operate, people don't trust you. And one way that you can kind of build trust is to be more open about how you operate. And I think some companies would be willing to listen to that kind of an argument and maybe, if we're lucky, act on it. Okay, another one around contract transparency, a bit related to this. So judging from your experience within the secrecy of industry, how soon can we see contracts on web pages? So I think we're making progress. Contract transparency is really important for a few reasons. it's very difficult. So there's been a lot of attention on payment disclosure. That was what the EITI first focused on. This is what the new US and the EU laws require. It's very difficult to interpret payment data if you don't have the contract. So for instance, if ExxonMobil says, oh, we paid $400 million in royalties, you can't really tell like whether that's appropriate or not, or the context of that payment, unless you know, okay, these are the following payment obligations that ExxonMobil has, and that's what's in the contract. You also need the contract to see whether a company received a favorable deal. A colleague and I put out a report last year on certain kinds of oil trading contracts that the Nigerian government entered into. And we were able to get some of the contracts, not because they were published, but because they were leaked and shared with us by various connections. And analyzing the terms of those contracts and talking to industry experts, you could see that the company had received like such a sweet deal to the cost of the country. It was costing Nigeria as much as $16 a barrel, just some of these really unbalanced terms that were in the contract. So unless you have disclosure, then you can't tell that kind of thing. And then obviously disclosure then acts as a deterrent for people signing really unbalanced contracts. But anyway, your question was, how realistic is this? I just get excited about contract transparency. So there's progress. There's two, if you're interested in kind of getting a snapshot of how many contracts are out there, we with some partners have a website that's called resourcecontracts.org. And there's hundreds and hundreds of contracts on there from countries around the world, and you can search by country and download the actual documents. And what that website shows is that this isn't some crazy thing that isn't going to happen for 50 years. There are a lot of contracts out there, and a few countries already, kind of like Guinea is one, a couple other, Liberia in Africa, a few others, already disclose contracts kind of as a normal matter of course, which is great. There's lots and lots of other countries where that's not true. So it's just a matter of us getting over this hump where now it's kind of an unusual thing to do to where it's a normal thing to do. And it's something that we're really pushing on. There's a few different levers that we're pushing. So, one important part is trying to get companies to disclose contracts. Some have chosen to do so, but often not universally, often not in every country where they operate. Pushing contract transparency through the EITI is another option. Right now, contract transparency is encouraged by the EITI standard, but not required. The Philippines, for example, just chose to publish all their mining contracts online through an EITI kind of organized process. So, it's a work in progress, I guess. There's a long way to go until this is just normal operating procedure. One other interim step that I think sometimes can be helpful is trying to get governments to at least commit to disclosing new contracts. I think a lot of the resistance to contract transparency is because either a government or a company has a couple deals that they know are really problematic. And of course we want to see those, and that those are maybe the priority, but an easier request might be to say, okay, governments, at least from now on, any new contracts you sign should be transparent. So that's something else that we're trying in different contexts. Some of these are comments that are interesting, about the kind of governance challenges in Argentina and how the judiciary isn't politically independent. It's certainly a very common challenge. Weak democracies are the culprit. I mean, absolutely, right? You can have things like the EITI or the Africa Mining Vision. They're helpful, right? But like if the government is not accountable to the people, at the end of the day, some initiative that comes from outside is not going to kind of compensate for that shortcoming. So here's one on corruption. Can corruption only be fought with the help of pressure created within the national society? And are there cases where reforms raised from sectors inside the government in charge? So if I'm understanding the question right, it's how can change happen, especially in different political contexts? And when it comes to corruption, I think it's worth mentioning how important international law enforcement can be. This is something that I think we've made improvements over the last 10, 15 years, where in countries in Europe and North America where there's maybe more legal capacity and stronger laws against bribery, actually pursuing cases that started and took place in resource-rich developing countries. So, for instance, the U.S. Department of Justice pursued a case against the son of the dictator of Equatorial Guinea, and they did so because the son had this huge, gorgeous house in Malibu in California, and they were able to build a case that proved that the house was bought with the proceeds of corruption. So the corruption happened in Equatorial Guinea, but the asset was seized and the legal action was taken in the US. And I think that's quite promising because, waiting for Equatorial Guinea to police its own corruption, there's a great example of a country that, is not democratic, where civil society has very limited options, very limited capacity, but also is under tons of political pressure. There's not a lot of domestic avenues for change in a country like that, and it's very unfortunate. And the international system has a responsibility to, at least do what it can to make sure that any time that corrupt money ends up in the US or the UK or elsewhere, there's action taken and that there are consequences. And that's something effective, that kind of law enforcement action. And also things like visa bans, so saying like, okay, you corrupt officials, you can no longer enter the US or you can no longer enter the EU. These are effective tools. They're not going to, change the system overnight. But when it comes to kind of influencing the behavior of corrupt elites, I think they are quite meaningful, and we need to encourage those of us, in the West and then hopefully in other jurisdictions as well, need to encourage our governments to really pursue those cases. I think the other part of your question is whether, does change have to come from civil society or can it come from within the government? And I think there's lots of examples of where either through a change of government, the opposition comes into power and implements reforms, but even within a government, I mean, Nigeria is a good example of a change in power where in April the opposition won the elections on an anti-corruption platform and are moving forward on that, not as quickly as some of us would like, but they're moving forward. Myanmar is an example of how, yes, there was pressure to reform from outside, internationally, from different civil society groups, especially from outside the country. But there was also reformist elements from within that military dictatorship who took a decision, okay, we, for a variety of political and economic reasons, are going to open up. So you can see change happen that way as well, which is encouraging because there's some countries where it's just difficult to see the way forward, but then change is possible even in some political contexts where power seems so kind of entrenched. So we've got about 10 more minutes. I'm going to try to take a few more. Thank you so much for all your questions. It's really interesting. Again, I'm skipping India. Here's one about contracts. When they're signed between the country and the company, when the country does not allow the contract to be published, what can the company do? Okay, so yeah, I, I think that there's some. This is a really interesting question. I mean, we did some research on confidentiality clauses, and found that they're often not as binding as people think that they are. The government, in particular, can often take unilateral action and disclose a contract. Companies have certainly done so on occasion. Sometimes when a company wants to go public, like list on an international stock exchange, you've seen companies publish contracts through that process in order to explain to investors, okay, these are the kinds of deals that we're operating. This is, how much our company helping to establish the value of the company. So there are some examples like that of unilateral disclosures by companies, and that, as far as I know, haven't resulted in any kind of sanction from the government. So I think it's the bigger problem is more a lack of interest from either side, and people using the other party as an excuse for not taking action. So you often hear companies say, "Oh, we disclose our contracts, but the government doesn't want to," and the government saying the exact same thing. We would disclose our contracts, but the company doesn't want to. I think that's more of a cat and mouse game, rather than a real obstacle, like a real hard obstacle that couldn't be worked around. Here's a really interesting one from Michael about civil society. So, how can you expect civil society that is largely donor dependent and that lacks a social base to ensure sustainable and effective accountability and transparency? I mean, this is like such a fundamental question, particularly for organizations like the one that I work for. Like, when you're talking about NGOs, when you're talking about non-governmental organizations, where does their legitimacy come from? Who appointed them to speak on behalf of the public interest? I do not have an answer to that question, even though I work for an NGO and I, try to pursue public interest causes. I certainly don't have an answer to that question. I think it's something that we all need to think about a lot. In resource-rich developing countries, just like in any other country, civil society is not just about donor-dependent, to use your word, NGOs. Civil society also includes the media. It includes trade unions, labor unions, religious groups, professional associations like the Bar Association or an engineers association. And often those kinds of groups do have broader bases, right? They do have more links to like large numbers of people within that country. And they can play a political role, and an important role in terms of reform. They again, I think it's just a question of different political contexts, but I think that we should think about civil society in that broader context, not just kind of NGOs, which tend to rely on external funding and focus on specific issues. Those NGOs, play a really valuable role in a lot of countries, in my view. But I certainly understand where your question is coming from, and I think it's the kind of thing that we all need to think about regularly. Like, where does the legitimacy of civil society come from? On whose behalf are we speaking? And how can we kind of make sure that it's as credible as possible? So thanks a lot for raising that. I'm going to try to take two more. Some of these I'm answering ones that choosing ones that I think I can answer in a capable manner. So here's one about the SDGs. Do you believe that the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals that were agreed in September will make a difference? And I mean, this relates a lot back to what I was saying about the Africa mining vision. These various international tools are useful. They're useful for having conversations that stretch across multiple countries. They're useful for targeting international money, development assistance. I mean, the SDGs are a great example. Like, they should help to kind of coordinate international spending on development and on poverty reduction. And that kind of coordination, of course, is really helpful. That if you have donors spending money through some kind of strategy, through some kind of agreed prioritization, those funds at the end of the day should end up being better used. You know, less duplication, less inefficiency, etc. Will they achieve that coordinating purpose? I hope so. But what you see is donors often want to do their own thing as well. So it's always a tension with these big global initiatives. You know, will all of the countries involved line up behind those decisions that are made and work together in a coordinated manner? I mean, past experience suggests that, you know, there'll be some efforts to do that, and then there'll be some efforts to not do that, and they'll be kind of the middle of the road. You know, I think that there's always a gap between these high-level conversations around the SDGs. You know, this big flurry of activity and ideas about, you know, what they should be, and then what impact they actually have on the lives of people in resource-rich countries or any other developing countries. You know, the international infrastructure that exists to try to deliver development is not a well-oiled machine. I don't think any of us, I'm sure you all agree with that. It's a flawed enterprise, but it's not an enterprise that should be abandoned. And hopefully things like the SDGs can make it run better. But I personally don't expect them to kind of you know, suddenly deliver this like extremely well-organized global effort to reduce poverty. It's going to continue to be a little bit ad hoc, a little bit poorly coordinated. It's just kind of the nature of the beast when you've got this many countries trying to coordinate. Okay, I'm going to take one more question. Trying to think of something that'll be nice to wrap up on. Let's go back up to the top, sorry. So another, yeah, this is good. I think another question about the drop in, oh, sorry, I picked the wrong one. Argentina, that was more of a comment on Argentina than a question, I think. So this is from Graham, you know, about kind of mining companies. As a result of the price drop, that company budgets are being sliced. And the cuts are happening, including in their social and environmental functions. Bankruptcies are on the rise. And then how does that impact the reality of activities of different stakeholders? And I think it's good to come back to this at the end because, you know, in terms of what's going on in the extractive sector right now, low prices is the name of the game. I mean, this is what's determining actions. Just in the paper, I think earlier this week, saw that Shell posted kind of record losses and is laying off 10,000 employees. So it's mining as well as the oil sector. This, yeah, it can have really challenging effects. It can lead to, as you mentioned, companies trying to cut corners when it comes to the safety and in the environment, and that can have, you know, as you know, disastrous ramifications. It also can lead to kind of a race to the bottom in terms of what kind of deals they're striking with resource-rich countries. Resource-rich countries maybe being so desperate to try to get investors, to try to get companies to come in, that they start lowering their standards and say, look, you guys just come, please, like, we'll give away the mine. We'll lower what we're asking you to pay us. We'll lower the kind of scrutiny that we'll put your operations under. So that kind of a race to the bottom risk is worrying, as is the kind of cutting of corners that you're talking about. In terms of how it impacts the activities of maybe external stakeholders or public interest stakeholders, I think we kind of I think there's some risk that when prices go down, attention to the extractive sector will also go down internationally, but also from domestic groups. And I think that's the wrong response. This is a time to kind of be extra vigilant that bad deals aren't being struck. I mean, you're seeing a lot of countries enter into oil-backed loans that don't make any sense because they're broke. And those are decisions that the country is going to be paying for decades. So the kinds of desperation that you see both governments and companies feeling right now can lead to bad decision making, and that's what we need to be kind of watching for, is making sure that the public interest doesn't get lost in all of this kind of deal making to get through these tough times. So I'm going to sign off with that. There's a few questions left that were really interesting to read, and thank you for submitting them. And thanks so much for joining and for participating in the course. It's great to see all of you here, and I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day wherever you are. Bye.